The sun hung high like a burning coin in the sky, pouring its relentless heat over the Arizona plains. The land shimmered and rippled as if the whole world were melting into waves of gold. Thomas Avery wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, feeling dust cling to his skin like tiny grains of salt. He had been working on the southern fence line since early morning, tightening old barbed wire and replacing rotted posts. Work never ended on a ranch this size, especially when he was doing most of it alone. The silence was a companion he had grown used to, dry wind brushing the grass, the occasional rustle of a lizard in the brush, the distant cry of a hawk sailing across the empty sky. Nothing ever changed here. That was the point of living so far from town. Peace had its price, but Thomas preferred it over noise and chaos. He bent down to hammer another nail into the rail when something in his peripheral vision flickered, an odd shadow stretching across the ground. At first, he ignored it, thinking it was just the glare from the sun playing tricks again. Heat haze could create illusions, bending light until normal things looked strange. But the shadow grew larger, darker, more defined. Thomas paused, straightened, and turned his head fully toward the open plains. For a moment, he squinted, trying to make sense of the strange, tall shape moving toward him. It wasn't a horseman. It wasn't a wagon. It wasn't anything he recognized at that distance. The shape swayed slightly as it walked, almost as if the earth beneath it was unsteady. He felt an instinctive prickle along his spine. Out here, unexpected visitors rarely meant something simple. After years in these lands, he had learned to read signs, listen to instinct, and trust caution. But the figure kept coming closer, slowly becoming less an illusion and more a person, an unusually large person. Thomas narrowed his eyes, his breath catching quietly in his throat. A woman. A tall, broad-shouldered Apache woman, towering so impressively that for a heartbeat he thought she might be a myth come alive. Her steps were heavy, slow, her movements labored. Her clothing, once proud traditional wear, was torn at the edges, stained with dust and dried sweat. Her long black hair hung loosely, tangled from wind and exhaustion. She looked as if she had crossed miles upon miles without rest. Thomas's first thought was confusion. Why would an Apache woman be wandering alone in the scorching plains at this hour? His second thought, the more practical one, was whether she was injured or running from something. He tightened his hold on the hammer unconsciously, not as a threat but as a reflex. When she finally reached speaking distance, she didn't raise a weapon, didn't shout, didn't demand or warn. Instead, she placed one hand on her knee, leaning forward slightly, her breathing rough and uneven. When she looked at him, her eyes weren't fierce or hostile. They were dry, pained, desperate. "Water," she said, barely more than a whisper. The sound scraped from her throat like dry stones. Thomas hesitated only a second. Despite his instinct to remain wary, humanity outweighed fear. No one could look at her condition and think she posed danger. She looked as though she'd collapse at any moment. Without a word, he set down his tools and gestured toward the well behind the barn. She followed him slowly, her steps dragging through the dust as if her legs might give out beneath her. He drew water with quick, practiced motions, lowering the bucket and pulling it up, the rope creaking. When he handed her the dipper, she snatched it with trembling hands and drank deeply, greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking into the earth at her feet. She drank as if the whole world might disappear before she finished. He watched her silently, trying to piece together who she was. Apache lands were far from here, their people rarely wandered this direction alone. Something must have gone terribly wrong. Yet she didn't offer any explanation, didn't speak more than that single word. When she finally stopped drinking, she stood still for a moment, eyes closed, as though letting the strength of the water sink back into her bones. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Thomas with an expression he didn't fully understand. Gratitude, yes, but something heavier too. Something like acknowledgement. As if she saw more in him than he realized. She straightened, taller now, steadier, her presence suddenly powerful again. Thomas felt small beside her, dwarfed not just by her height but by the weight she carried, cultural, spiritual, ancestral. She gave him one slow nod, a gesture that felt ceremonial, significant, and final. Before he could ask her anything, where she'd come from, whether she needed help, if she was lost, she turned and walked away, back toward the open plains. Her steps were stronger now, almost silent, as if the land itself carried her forward. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching her dark figure grow smaller against the vast desert until she finally disappeared from sight. The wind shifted, brushing past him gently, but the unease she left behind was heavier than any breeze. He didn't know who she was or what her presence meant. But something deep inside him whispered that his quiet, predictable life had just been disrupted by a force he could neither understand nor ignore. The evening settled over the desert with the slow, heavy grace of a blanket being pulled across the sky. The heat that had pounded the earth all afternoon slipped away little by little, leaving behind a warm, restless breeze that whispered through the dry grass. Thomas finished his work on the fence line, though his mind had been scattered ever since the giant Apache woman vanished over the horizon. Every time he hammered a nail or tightened a wire, her towering silhouette returned to him, replaying in his memory like an unfinished sentence. He had offered help before, of course, travelers, lost settlers, passing riders. But there had been something different about her presence, something he couldn't shake loose no matter how he tried to distract himself. By the time he walked back toward the ranch house, dusk had begun to color the sky in streaks of violet and rose. The chickens clucked lazily, preparing to settle for the night, and the horses shifted in their stalls as if sensing their owner's unease. Thomas stopped at the well again, his hand brushing the rim, remembering the way the woman had gripped the dipper, her thirst so intense it had looked painful. What could have driven her to such desperation? Apache groups traveled with precision and care, their warriors and scouts rarely got separated. It didn't make sense that she would be wandering so far from her people alone and without supplies. He entered the house, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Inside, everything was exactly where he had left it, the chairs, the tools, the folded blankets, but the air felt different, almost too still, like the pause before a storm. He lit a lantern, the flame flickering to life and pushing back the shadows along the walls. As he sat down at the small wooden table with his supper of beans and bread, he found he didn't have much appetite. The spoon hovered in his hand, unmoving, his mind replaying the moment she looked at him, her eyes steady and deep, as if she had seen straight through him. He tried to reason with himself. People passed through the desert all the time, some were lost, some were hurt, some simply needed a drink. Helping her didn't mean anything else would come of it. It was an act of basic decency, nothing more. Yet his instincts refused to settle. The land had taught him to pay attention when something inside him felt off. Out here, far from civilization, instincts weren't whispers, they were warnings written in invisible ink across the horizon. The lantern flame quivered suddenly, flickering as if brushed by an unseen hand. Thomas paused, listening. The ranch was normally full of small nightly sounds, the groan of the wooden beams, the rustle of animals, the distant call of coyotes, but tonight the silence pressed in tight around him. The absence of noise was louder than any sound. He pushed back his chair and stood, walking to the window and pulling aside the curtain. Outside, the sky had deepened into a rich indigo, dotted with early stars. The desert stretched in every direction, calm, empty, but something about the quiet was unnatural. He checked the barn, making sure the animals were calm. The horses shifted but didn't seem spooked, the chickens slept peacefully. Everything looked normal, but the feeling in his chest only grew heavier. He leaned against the barn door, staring into the distance where the woman had disappeared. He tried imagining her reunited with her people, trying to convince himself that there was nothing more to worry about. But the truth gnawed at him, she hadn't said anything except water. No explanation, no gratitude, no sign of fear. She hadn't even seemed lost in the usual sense. Her expression had carried purpose, even if he didn't understand it. He returned to the house and bolted the door out of habit, though he knew a simple latch wouldn't do much if trouble ever came. He washed his face, the cold water waking his senses, and placed the lantern on the bedside table. When he finally lay down, he stared at the wooden ceiling beams above him, tracing their shadows as the lantern's flame swayed in the warm air. Each creak of the house seemed sharper, each gust of wind outside more deliberate. He closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep, but rest wouldn't come. All he could see was the nod she had given him, the strange, firm acknowledgement, almost ceremonial in its weight. It was not the kind of nod a person gave when simply grateful. It was the kind someone gave when something larger had been set into motion. Hours passed, though Thomas couldn't tell how many. The lantern dimmed, the shadows thickened, and finally exhaustion washed over him like a slow tide. He drifted between sleep and wakefulness, his dreams filled with the endless desert, the woman's towering shape, and the unsettling quiet that had blanketed his ranch. When he finally slipped fully into sleep, his last conscious thought was a quiet, uneasy question he wished he had asked her. What happens now? And though he couldn't know it yet, the answer would arrive with the dawn. Carried on the hooves of 300 warriors whose presence would shake his world to its core, Thomas awoke before sunrise, stirred by a feeling he couldn't name. Not a sound had reached his ears, not a movement, not even the creak of the old house settling, but something inside him snapped awake abruptly, like a lantern being lit in a dark room. He lay still for a moment, listening. The air felt heavy, too heavy, as if something unseen pressed down on the walls of the ranch. Even before his eyes fully opened, his instincts whispered that something was terribly wrong. He sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath him. The faint early light filtered through the window, pale and cold. Usually, mornings brought a gentle chorus of rustling animals and scattering birds, but today the world outside was eerily silent. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood, every movement careful, cautious, almost involuntary. It felt as if even the floorboards beneath him were holding their breath. He walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside. What he saw froze his blood. A circle. A perfect, impossible circle of riders surrounding his entire ranch. Apache warriors, hundreds of them. Their horses stood still, their bodies rigid with discipline, forming an unbroken ring that stretched as far as the eye could follow. In the dim morning light, their silhouettes looked almost carved from stone. The glint of metal from spears and rifles caught the first touches of sunrise like sparks in the distance. Thomas gripped the window frame, his breath caught in his throat. He counted without meaning to, 10, 20, 40, before the sheer number overwhelmed him. There were too many. More than he had ever seen together in his life. 300 warriors. His mind stumbled over the number. Why were they here? Why now? And were they here because of the woman he had helped? His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat loud enough that he wondered if the warriors could hear it from outside. He backed away from the window slowly, as if sudden movement might ignite chaos. But he knew he couldn't hide. These men did not appear by accident. Their formation was deliberate, organized, purposeful. He walked to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hands trembled as he unlatched the bolt, hesitating for a long moment. The morning light spilled into the house when he opened the door, revealing the vast circle of warriors more clearly. They watched him without speaking, without twitching, without so much as a shift in their saddles. Their eyes were dark and steady, unreadable, but powerful in their silence. Thomas lifted his hands slowly, palms forward, a universal gesture of surrender, of peace, of helplessness. The warriors did not react. Not a flinch, not a murmur, not a nod. The quiet stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He felt small, exposed, like a man standing on a cliff edge with no handhold. The land around him seemed to fade beneath the weight of their presence. Time blurred. He didn't know if minutes or hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched from the horses toward him like fingers of darkness. Thomas's legs ached from standing still, but he didn't dare lower his hands. He scanned the circle, searching for some sign, some indication of what they wanted. But every warrior's face remained stone-like, calm, focused, as if carved from the same earth they protected. His mind raced desperately. Was he being punished? Had he trespassed unknowingly? Had the woman accused him? No, she hadn't spoken more than a single word. She had looked at him with something like respect. But perhaps her people saw things differently. Perhaps offering water had been seen as interference. Perhaps he had violated some tradition he didn't understand. The longer he stood, the more fear wrapped itself around him like thorny vines. He imagined attacks, revenge, silent executions carried out in the early morning light. He forced the thought away. Apache warriors weren't mindless killers. They acted with purpose, with honor. But honor didn't always align with a settler's understanding. Then, at last, something shifted. A ripple passed through the circle, not a noise, but a movement so subtle Thomas barely noticed at first. The warriors parted in one section, creating a narrow passage. Through it rode a lone figure on a large, powerful horse. His bearing was calm, authoritative, his posture straight and commanding. He wore feathers woven into his braids, symbols only a leader carried. Even before he reached the center, Thomas knew who he was. The chief. He approached slowly, his horse stepping with deliberate precision until he stopped just a few paces from Thomas. The chief's gaze was deep and sharp, the kind that seemed to see far beyond flesh and bone. Thomas lowered his hands carefully, though his fingers still trembled. The chief stared at him for a long time. Not with anger. Not with hostility. But with a scrutiny that made Thomas feel like he was being measured by something ancient and unspoken. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying across the silent land like a rolling wave. "You gave water to my daughter." The words hit Thomas with the force of a sudden gust. He blinked, stunned, his fear momentarily replaced by confusion. Daughter? The towering woman? The one wandering alone? His breath caught again, but this time from shock rather than terror. And before he could gather the words to respond, the chief continued, his expression unreadable, his meaning deeper than Thomas could yet understand. And that moment, those few spoken words, changed everything. The chief's words hung in the air like a heavy stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through Thomas's chest. He felt his breath catch as the meaning sank in. The giant woman, his daughter? He hadn't imagined her strength or size, but now the weight of her presence made sense. She had carried herself like someone trained, someone respected, someone important. Thomas's throat tightened as the chief stepped closer, his footsteps soft in the dust but carrying the power of generations. The warriors around them remained silent as statues, their gazes fixed on the center where the truth was unfolding. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to gather his words. She looked like she needed help. I only gave her water, he managed, though his voice felt thinner than he expected. The chief studied him with a long, unwavering look that made Thomas feel as though every thought inside him was being inspected. The chief's eyes held both sorrow and authority, the gaze of a man who carried the responsibility of many lives. You gave water when she was near death, the chief said, his voice deep and measured. Her strength is great, but even the strongest warrior cannot fight thirst. He turned his head slightly, glancing outward toward the horizon where his daughter had vanished the day before. She was separated from her group. She wandered without food, without shade, without water for 2 days. Many would have passed her by. Many would have feared her. He shifted his gaze back to Thomas. But you did not. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. Anyone would have helped her, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Fear between settlers and Apache ran deep, fueled by stories and assumptions on both sides. It was easier for people to avoid each other than to risk an unknown encounter. The chief's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened slightly, like a flicker of acknowledgement. Among our people, the chief continued, water is more than water. It is life, spirit, breath. To give water to one who cannot find it is to return their spirit to them. His voice grew quieter, deeper, like the echo of a drum. You saved the life of my daughter. And so, you have changed the path of our tribe. Thomas's heartbeat thudded loud in his ears. He didn't know what to make of that. Gratitude from the Apache was not a simple matter. Their customs were deep, intertwined with honor and consequence. But the chief's tone held no threat, no anger. Only truth. The kind of truth that rearranged a man's understanding of the world. The chief lifted his hand, and from the circle a young warrior rode forward, carrying something long and wrapped in decorated animal hide. He dismounted, approached with reverence, and unwrapped the item before placing it at Thomas's feet. A spear, its shaft carved with intricate patterns, feathers tied near the grip, and the blade forged to a fine, sharp gleam. The craftsmanship was unlike anything Thomas had seen. It wasn't a weapon meant for battle alone, it was symbolic, sacred. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, gripping the spear tightly, feeling the carvings under his fingers, each groove and line telling a story he could not yet read. His chest rose and fell rapidly as the weight of the chief's words settled on him. Protection. 300 warriors. The enormity of it threatened to crush him, yet there was a strange calm beneath the fear, a quiet understanding that what had begun with a simple act of giving water had changed everything. For the first time, he felt the presence of forces far larger than himself, forces that moved with precision, honor, and purpose, yet could have destroyed him without hesitation. The chief made a slight gesture, and the young warrior who had delivered the spear stepped forward again, offering silent instruction. Thomas could feel that every action, every pause, every movement of the warriors around him was deliberate, part of a ritual older than he could imagine. They were not just men on horses, they were living extensions of a culture, a living declaration that his act of kindness had earned him more than gratitude, it had earned him an unspoken bond, a shield he could not yet comprehend. Thomas looked down at the spear, feeling the balance of it in his hand. It was heavier than a simple tool, heavier than it seemed, not in weight but in responsibility. Holding it, he imagined himself as a part of the circle he had just witnessed, a guardian not just of his land but of something far older, something larger than his small ranch and quiet life. His mind raced, thinking of the battles he could never fight, of dangers he had avoided simply by choosing to act without fear, by choosing to help. How many men had refused water or aid out of suspicion or pride? How many had lost more than just lives for their hesitation? He thought again of the towering woman, the one who had begun all of this with a simple nod, her eyes deep with unspoken messages. The chief's voice drew him back from these thoughts. The spear marks you as protector, he said quietly, yet with undeniable authority. It is not for fighting alone, nor for showing power. It is for honor, for acknowledgement, for the covenant between you and our people. You have given life where it could have been lost. We repay life with our own vigilance. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to comprehend the gift before him. He had known fear, loneliness, and exhaustion in these lands, but he had never imagined a day like this, never imagined that an act so small in his mind could ripple outward, creating consequences he could not yet fully understand. The chief stepped back, raising a hand toward the circle of warriors, who immediately straightened, their formations precise and unwavering. Thomas watched them, awestruck. They moved like one organism, each part supporting the others, each part ready to act if necessary, yet serene in the early morning light. The chief looked once more at Thomas, his gaze steady and piercing. You will no longer be alone here. Our warriors will stand beside you if threats approach. But understand this protection is a covenant. Respect it, respect our ways, respect life, and it will endure. Ignore it, and the consequences fall upon those who fail to honor it. You have already proven your heart is true. Remember that. Thomas nodded, his voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. I understand, he stammered. I only did what I thought was right. The chief inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried more weight than words. Then you have already begun. The rest will follow your actions. The silence returned for a moment, but it no longer pressed on him. Instead, it felt steady, supportive, alive with the presence of those who had been witnesses to courage, and those who had now joined him as guardians of his life. Thomas felt the earth beneath him differently, more grounded, as if it acknowledged the unseen forces surrounding him. The desert wind shifted, brushing past, carrying with it the scent of sage, earth, and distant fire. Each breath he drew seemed heavier with meaning, each heartbeat stronger with awareness. He glanced around at the circle of warriors, hundreds of them, still silent, still observing. There was no menace here anymore, only strength and vigilance. He could feel their respect and the unspoken understanding that his actions had earned him a place among them, not as one of them, perhaps, but as a trusted ally, a human bound to their honor. Thomas could not have imagined a more profound moment. He had lived a quiet life, isolated, wary, cautious. Yet in this quiet, in this heat and dust, he had acted with simple decency, and it had changed his world forever. Finally, the chief signaled once more, and the warriors began to shift, not leaving yet, but repositioning to their original formation. Thomas realized he was still holding the spear, gripping it tightly as if afraid to let go, afraid the moment would vanish if he did. But the chief's eyes told him he was ready to release the weight, to carry it forward in his own way. He straightened, shoulders stiff, and lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the woman had disappeared the day before. Somewhere out there, she was safe, and her people were entire again. And because of him, the balance had been restored, the covenant formed, and a promise of protection sealed. The chief's voice came one last time, steady, commanding, carrying the weight of generations. Go inside. Your life begins anew here, watched, honored, and respected. Learn the ways, and you will not regret it. You gave life today, Thomas Avery. Never forget that the simplest acts ripple further than even the strongest man can imagine. Thomas lowered the spear slowly, the carvings warm under his fingers. His heart still raced, but he felt the calm beneath it growing stronger. The warriors remained in formation, their eyes like living sentinels, guardians of something he could not yet name. And as he walked back toward his ranch house, the first true understanding of what had occurred began to settle in. A simple act of kindness, water given freely, had created a bond deeper than fear, stronger than violence, and more enduring than the desert itself. He paused at the doorway, turned to look once more at the vast circle of warriors standing in quiet vigil, and knew that for the first time in his life, he was not alone. And in that moment, the wind seemed to whisper not just across the plains, but directly to him, carrying the silent promise of protection, honor, and life restored. The warriors began to move, shifting subtly at first, then with more deliberate motion. Horses shuffled, hooves scraping the earth, the sound low but steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Thomas watched, still gripping the spear, unsure whether to step forward or remain frozen. The chief gave a small gesture, and the movement became more coordinated. One by one, the riders turned, guiding their horses away from the ranch, maintaining their perfect, disciplined formation even as they withdrew. The circle that had felt so imposing, so absolute, began to dissolve, leaving Thomas with a strange mixture of awe and relief. He could feel the tremor of their departure through the ground, each hoof-fall a reminder of the power and presence that had just been with him. As the last of the warriors disappeared over the horizon, Thomas lowered the spear and leaned against the doorway, his chest heaving. The desert stretched before him, vast, silent, and yet profoundly different than it had before. It was no longer just land he lived on, it was a space watched over, respected, and protected. The air itself seemed fuller, as though carrying the weight of unseen eyes and silent guardians. He felt the enormity of what had happened settle over him slowly, like a tide that had begun far away and was finally reaching shore. He walked back into the house, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. Inside, everything was unchanged. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of morning light, the scent of dry earth lingered faintly in the air, and the quiet tick of the old clock on the wall marked time as it always had. But Thomas knew he was changed. His life, once solitary and predictable, had been rewritten by something much larger than himself, something that transcended fear, distance, and even understanding. The giant Apache woman had been the spark, but the fire that followed was beyond his comprehension, carried in the honor and discipline of her people. He placed the spear carefully against the wall, studying it as if it were a living thing. Each carved symbol, each feather, each etched line told a story he could not yet read fully, but he felt the weight of it in his hands and in his chest. It was not just a weapon, it was a covenant, a declaration that his life now belonged to something larger, something eternal. He traced the carvings with his fingers, imagining the hands that had shaped them, the eyes that had guided each mark, the generations of warriors who had carried such objects into battle and back again. And in that moment, he understood that protection was not merely about strength or numbers, it was about honor, observation, and respect. Thomas stepped outside again, the morning sun warming his face and arms, and looked over the land he had called home for so long. The fence he had repaired yesterday seemed smaller now, the ranch itself somehow contained within a larger story he had only just begun to grasp. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and dust, sweeping over the plains like a whispered reminder of the warriors who had passed through, and he felt a deep, almost spiritual calm settle over him. The encounter had not just protected him physically, it had shifted the very rhythm of his existence, connecting him to forces and values he had never experienced. He thought again of the giant woman, the one who had begun this chain of events with a single, desperate request for water. Her strength, her presence, and her quiet authority had changed the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. She had been both fragile and unstoppable, vulnerable yet commanding, and her silent acknowledgement had carried a weight heavier than any words. Thomas realized that his act of kindness had been witnessed, measured, and returned in a form beyond his comprehension, through the power and discipline of the warriors who had appeared almost like shadows from legend. As he walked along the fence line, checking the repairs he had made, Thomas began to see the land differently. The sun now seemed to illuminate not just the earth, but the stories hidden within it, the invisible threads connecting him, the woman, and the warriors who had protected him. He felt a new respect for the desert, for the isolation, for the lives that had come before him and those that would continue long after. Everything seemed sharper, more meaningful. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt sacred, filled with possibility and protection rather than fear. By midday, Thomas sat on the porch, the spear resting beside him. He looked toward the horizon, imagining the giant woman returning to her people, safe and whole, and the warriors who had surrounded his ranch, steady and disciplined. He realized that the act of giving water, simple and human as it had been, had created ripples far beyond what he could see. Kindness, he understood now, was never small, it carried the power to reshape lives, forge bonds, and command respect in ways the mind could not predict. He felt a deep gratitude not only for the protection offered but for the lesson that life, when met with courage and compassion, could unfold in ways both mysterious and profound. Thomas remained on the porch until the sun reached its peak, absorbing the heat, the light, and the quiet strength of the land. He knew that life on the ranch would continue, that chores, fences, and animals would demand his attention as always. But something inside him had shifted permanently. The world was larger, richer, and more alive than it had ever seemed before, and he carried with him the knowledge that a single act of help could summon forces of honor and protection beyond imagination. As the day unfolded, Thomas felt a calm determination settle in his bones. He walked through the ranch with renewed purpose, checking the animals, the fences, and the fields. Every detail of his land now seemed sacred, watched over by unseen eyes that had once been present in human form. And though the warriors had disappeared over the horizon, their presence lingered in the air, in the earth, in the quiet wind brushing across the plains. Thomas Avery understood, finally, that he was no longer merely a lonely rancher in the desert. He had become part of a larger story, a story of honor, protection, and respect that would carry on long after the footprints in the dust had faded. He had given water to one in need, and in doing so, he had been given life in return, protected, watched, and honored in a way he could never have imagined. The desert was still vast, still silent, yet it had been transformed. And Thomas knew, with a quiet certainty, that he would never see his world in the same way again.